This evening's Mansfield public talk. This evening, for those who don't know, my name's Helen Mansfield. I'm the principal here. These talks are open to everybody, and this is the first of our talks this term. And I'm delighted that our speaker this evening is Dr. Ryan Hanley from Exeter University, who is a visiting fellow at Mansfield at the moment. And he has had a very busy couple of weeks, starting getting married and then doing all sorts of seminars at the Bodleian and a seminar a conference at Queen Mary in London yesterday. So he's a busy man, but I'm very pleased that he's decided to come to talk to us this evening about his latest book, which is about Robert Wedderburn, and it's called Robert Wedderburn, British Insurrectionary, Jamaican Abolitionist. It's published this year by Yale University Press. And Ryan and I had a conversation about where he should pitch this talk, because the other long-term project that he's working on is about a long history of British slavery and the abolition of British slavery, because there will be an anniversary in 2032. But it's a very big and very long book, and so we're a long way from 2032. So we thought he would talk about the book that he has written about an extraordinary and charismatic 18th century man, and also talking about the relevance of studying this kind of history for today. So he's going to give his talk and then take a few questions afterwards. Thank you very much, Ryan, for joining us.
Well, good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me? Very good. Well, thank you so much for spending this beautiful, warm, sunny evening with me, even though I understand probably about half of you are just in here for the air conditioning. But I'll try to make it worth your while, at least, with an interesting story. Now, it's the 2nd of May today, which means that yesterday, of course, was May Day, which is one of the most storied and indeed contested holidays in the British calendar. Now, there we go. That's the title of the talk. Now, May Day, of course, has its roots in ancient pagan festival of Beltane, which is traditionally marked the transition into summer, a time to put the cattle out to summer pasture, and it certainly felt like the start of summer this year. Despite the best efforts of that notorious party pooper, Oliver Cromwell, May Day celebrations were historically treated as a rather harmless affair, an example of a harmless English rural eccentricity. Throughout the early modern period, this festival was largely seen as an opportunity for working folk to let loose and perhaps indulge in a little mischief-making. With its pagan symbolism, customary dances, and of course a symbolic election of the May King and May Queen from among the commoners, May Day sits within that peculiar British tradition of topsy-turvy, a moment of opportunity when rigid social hierarchies could, if only temporarily, be mocked, disdained, the world turned upside down. It's perhaps fitting then that since the late 19th century, May Day has also marked International Workers' Day. Throughout Europe and North America, the 1st of May has become a traditional date for organised labour movements to stage marches and strikes. In 1890, the first May Day march in Britain took place at Hyde Park, where socialist activist Eleanor Marx, daughter of Karl, addressed a crowd assembled to demand the 8-hour workday. Marx concluded her speech by quoting the famous lines from Percy Shelley's Mask of Anarchy. "Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." Now, Marx knew her stuff. 8 years later, she co-authored a book on Shelley and his influence on the early British socialist movement. And perhaps she was aware that her literary idol shared a publisher with another early ultra-radical intellectual, the Jamaican Scottish working-class reformer, Robert Wedderburn. Now, that was a long walk, wasn't it, to get to where we're going to begin? But Robert Wedderburn is worth it. He is one of what Peter Linebaugh would describe as an organic radical. From his early years, he seemed destined to be a rebel. He was born into slavery in the early 1770s in the aftermath of Tacky's War, which was, up to that point, the largest insurrection of enslaved people in Caribbean history. He was raised, in the early 1760s, I should say, that was a typo. I thought that didn't sound quite right. He was raised by his grandmother, a reputed Obeah-woman, an African spiritual practitioner named Torquay Amy, who was punished under accusation of bewitching slaving ships and smuggling enslaved people off the island of Jamaica. On his father's side, the white side of his family, he was the paternal grandson of Sir John Wedderburn, one of the leaders of the Jacobite uprising of 1745, the last major Scottish uprising against English rule. So it seems as though insurrection was in his blood. But when he came to Britain in the mid-1780s, he first of all tried to settle down to a rather more sedate life. He married a local girl and trained as a journeyman tailor. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to detail Robert Wedderburn's political awakening, his turn away from trying to lead a quiet and uneventful life towards political radicalism, and the early days of his rise to becoming one of the most charismatic and influential anti-slavery, working-class radicals of his generation, and indeed of the 19th century. So, I'll come back to that. It was an open secret that the tailors pissed on the soldiers' uniforms. This is how it worked. Each of the rolls of cloth, stamped with a broad R to show they were the property of the Crown, were first weighed, and then certificates were issued with the weights written on them. When the tailors arrived at the factory in the morning, each of them got a roll of cloth with the matching certificate, to which was added their name and the date. They'd then take the rolls of cloth upstairs to the workshop, make the military uniforms, and return them to the warehouse, along with the certificates and any offcuts. The uniforms, along with the offcuts, were then weighed again and checked against the certificates that had been issued in the morning. If those weights matched, or near enough, then the tailors would be paid and could pick up another roll of cloth, as long as more soldiers' uniforms were needed. They usually were. By 1813, Britain was simultaneously at war with the juggernaut of Napoleonic France and, again, with the upstart former colonies in North America. The conflicts, the most totalizing in British history so far, had generated a boom in several industries, including, obviously, the manufacture of military uniforms. These particular uniforms were for Britain's Spanish and Portuguese allies in the fight against Napoleonic forces on the Iberian Peninsula. This certificate system was designed to stop the tailors from taking leftover scraps of cloth for their own use, sneaking them home at the end of the day. But the tailors, to quote one contemporary source, could make up deficient weight and were in the practice of doing so by making urine upon the cloth. Hardly the most elegant scheme, but it worked. That is, until the manager at the military contractor's office, Mr. Stevens, caught wind of it. On the 16th of October, Stevens lay in wait with about 12 constables, and at his signal, they rushed the tailors as they were making their way home, perhaps with a look of relief on their faces, at the end of the day. In the confusion, several pieces of cloth fell to the ground, and 9 out of the 70 subcontracted tailors were apprehended. The next morning, the officers apprehended another 25 suspects as they arrived for work. When he was taken into custody, Robert was heard to say that he thought what they had done was no robbery, that some men were cleverer than others, and that should they hang a dozen a week, they could not put a stop to it. For the moment a man becomes an apprentice tailor, he becomes a thief. When the tailors were arraigned before the magistrate later that day, they were asked what they knew about the thefts and if they were able to give any names. Robert's cross-examination was the longest and most detailed of all of them. This is from a newspaper report of this trial. It was a minor scandal in 1813. It says, Robert Wedderburn said that he could not account for the conduct of others. He knew that in his own country, the West Indies, tailors were much given to cabbage, and he presumed the case was the same here. For himself, he did not pretend to more honesty than other men, but supposing he had no regard to honesty, he certainly had some to prudence, some regard to himself and his family. In the employ of Mr. Mabberley, the army contractor, he'd not held a position of trust, and nothing was so odious as the character of an informer. Indeed, he would sooner go to Botany Bay than to become one. Now, Robert was not mistaken at all about British tailors' predilection for cabbage, and he was being sincere when he claimed that he thought it was no robbery. Exactly as in the West Indies, getting to keep a small amount of excess fabric from commissions, cabbage, had long been one of the traditional perks of the job. Why cabbage? Because if you roll up loads of scraps of balls of cloth, it resembles a head of cabbage. Cabbage was in many ways equivalent to the customary gleanings from harvests allowed to rural labourers throughout the 18th century, or to the small items of stationery, sometimes, I'm told, purloined from offices by workers today. It was not legal, exactly, but it was accepted as a feature of the broader economy, and most turned a blind eye so long as the amounts involved were not significant. Indeed, in the 19th century slang, cabbage was synonymous with a tailor's income. A tailor's cabbage, his pay. And the scraps were often used to make clothes and other small items for their families at home. According to another newspaper report of this trial, Robert had suggested that tailors imbibed the practice in the first 6 months of their apprenticeships and never forgot it. Indeed, even in the workshop in which he was employed, 8 ounces of cabbage per day were explicitly permitted on their contracts of employment. As Robert quipped in the witness stand, quote, "To say the same weight must be brought back that was given out could only be to make me black." Now that line got a laugh from the court. Black was a common shorthand in 18th century Britain for dishonesty, a holdover from centuries of biblical misreadings. Robert knew full well what people thought of him. But times were changing, and as trades like tailoring moved increasingly towards a more formalised wage labour model, employers and subcontractors began to crack down on practices like this, seeking more control over how their merchandise was used. This is just one of the many ways in which working conditions and customary perquisites for labourers and artisans was degraded during the rapid industrialisation of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Culture had shifted more broadly, and tradesmen that continued to take advantage of these traditional perks were roundly criticised and increasingly liable to prosecution by their employers. By the 1850s, the practice had fallen so far from favour that this meaning of the word cabbage was no longer widely used or even known, and it begins to appear in dictionaries of obscure slang from about 1851. So that's why, when I said cabbage, you didn't know what I was talking about, by the way. Of course, stealing entire rolls of fabric, as was accused to have happened in this case, went well beyond a customary perk, and Robert was facing quite a significant charge during his trial, with a sentence of at least 6 months' imprisonment. Nevertheless, his comment about preferring to be transported to the convict colony at Botany Bay than to inform on his colleagues was well observed. As long as nobody grasped, then most of them were safe. As the alderman of the court observed during the trial, in a case of this nature where so many were implicated, it was out of his power to discriminate betwixt the innocent and the guilty. It worked. In the end, of the 38 tailors arrested in this minor scandal, only 7 were ever convicted, and Robert was not among them. Now, solidarity was extremely important to tailors, and not only when evading the law. There were 2 types of tailor in early 19th century London, flint and dung. Flints were members of a club which negotiated wages, essentially a trade union, and were usually paid by the day in large-scale jobs, like this one at the army contractors. Lower status dung tailors mended clothes and hawked poor quality garments, often stitched together out of cabbage, from ramshackle wooden stalls in the small stinking courts situated off the main highways. Now, Robert had worked as a dung in his time, but in 1813, as implied by his refusal to inform on his colleagues, he was a flint, member of a trade club. He would have enjoyed some social benefits from membership, including the inevitable invitation to the pub after work. They're easy to overlook as generative sites for radicalism, but pubs have always had an important part to play in working class politics in Britain. Robert was almost certainly at a pub with his trade club in 1813 when he met Thomas Spence, a man who was to change his life profoundly. Now, at 63 years old, Spence was a veteran radical and with immaculate working class credentials. Spence had jumped headfirst into London's radical politics during the great wave of activism in the early 1790s, the years after the onset of the French Revolution, and he spent much of his adult life in jail for expressing staunchly anti-monarchist beliefs. Perhaps most influentially for Robert, who at this point in his life still could not read or write, Spence was a bookseller and a passionate advocate for the importance of literacy and education in the fight for social equality. Since 1812, Spence had redoubled his efforts to reach out to poor artisans who were suffering from degradations to their working conditions and the loss of their conventional rights. In other words, men exactly like Robert. Spence's modus operandi had always been to hold free and easies in the back rooms of pubs. At these informal and largely unstructured political meetings, poor men spoke outrageously and openly about the idiots who ran the country, sharing pots of beer, squinting and shouting through clouds of pipe smoke, not just dreaming of a better future, but actively making plans to forge one. Robert was captivated. It was not only the way it was organised. Spence's political philosophy and vision for the future could hardly be better suited to a man of Robert's background and experience. It was all about disrupting the concentration and hoarding of excessive wealth, especially wealth in land. At the core of Spence's ideology was the idea that all land should be held in common as a people's farm, and crucially that all forms of inheritance should be abolished. The Spencean plan, as Robert and his fellow converts, now styling themselves as the Spencean philanthropists, sort of like sounds like an early 19th century boy band, the Spencean philanthropists, called it. This was a vision of agrarian communitarianism. It bears quite a lot in common with later forms of socialist and communist collectivization. It's almost like a kind of Leninist 5-year plan, but in the 1810s. Now, many of these new disciples argued that this new utopian world could only be realized through popular uprising. As part of their revolutionary outlook, Spenceans took special aim at the concept of legitimacy as nothing more than a mechanism designed to oppress the poor. As Spence himself would put it in 1803, when the revolution came, common land, quote, shall be deemed the equal property of man, woman, and child, whether old or young, rich or poor, legitimate or illegitimate. But Robert was drawn to Spence's ideas for another reason. Unlike many reformists of the early 19th century, Spence did not see any reason why freeborn Englishmen should have an exclusive claim to liberty. His plan for bringing about land into common ownership explicitly embraced colonized people, as he outlined in a 1796 pamphlet entitled The Reign of Felicity, being a plan for civilizing the Indians of North America without infringing on their national or individual independence. Slavery was also an important point of reference for Spence's politics. He described the slave trade as, quote, fraught with every mischief and evil to the human race. More importantly, perhaps for Robert, Spence envisioned the coming revolution to be led not just by white labouring men, but by a motley multitude that included, quote, urban labourers, soldiers and seamen, beggars and prisoners, Native Americans and African slaves, women and children, Calibans and witches perhaps like his grandmother. Here then was a political movement that centred Robert's experiences, reconciling his nascent working-class radicalism with the intellectual traditions of defiance that he'd learned from his grandmother and mother before him. So, how did Spence's plan, obviously an incredibly extreme plan for reform, to abolish inheritance completely and to abolish all landlords, all ownership of land, how did such an obviously extreme plan draw such large crowds so regularly? On more than one occasion, Robert had spoken in support of Spence's plan in these pubs, and upwards of 50, up to 100 people were attending every single week, these plans, in the back rooms of pubs in East London. So the end of the Napoleonic Wars had worsened an already dire situation for the working poor in Britain. Mass demobilisation of soldiers and sailors meant that oversupply in the labour market, which of course drove wages down. At the same time, all the work associated with the war effort work like Robert's stint making uniforms at the army contractors suddenly disappeared. Alongside this, new advances in manufacturing technology further reduced the need for labour in many traditional skilled trades. Alongside all this pressure on the labour market, bread prices shot up after 1815. So, inflation in food prices, stagnation in wages. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. In this context, the idea of a people's farm was understandably attractive, but in truth, all flavours of radicalism experienced a resurgence in these years. In short, people were becoming desperate, and their government appeared to be interested only in protecting those who were already well off. A major symptom of the extent of public discontent manifested in December 1816, when a huge demonstration at Spa Fields in London devolved into rioting. Many Spenceans had been closely involved in planning this meeting, and indeed the riot seems to have been premeditated by them. The popular uprising demanded by some, it seems, was close at hand. This is a contemporary caricature showing the supposed planning of the Spa Fields riot. If you look on the right, you can see a racist caricature of the Black Dwarf, which was not, in fact, Robert Wedderburn, but the pseudonym for another radical journalist. But I mean, it goes to show the kind of prevalent attitude of racialization and the association between men like Robert Wedderburn and the Spencean philanthropists with concerns about civil unrest. Now, Robert's star by this point was on the rise in this energized ultra-radical underworld. Even so, in 1814, a schism had formed among the Spencean philanthropists between the armed insurrectionist camp on one hand and those who sought reform via more moderate constitutional means on the other. Robert, of course, belonged to the former camp. Government spies had been keeping tabs on him for a while, and a number of reports captured his activities in the Free and Easies during 1817, including his participation in a debate at the Mulberry Tree on the ominous question of what constitutes treason. He also alarmed spies by, quote, promulgating atheism during a debate on the 13th of November, where, quote, he boldly vociferated his opinion that there is no deity or future state beyond the grave. Robert's bravery in these debating sessions bordered on the foolhardy, especially since he was well aware that there were government spies planted in the audience. One such informer must have been sweating a little bit in his seat when Robert stood up in front of about 100 attendees and declared that, quote, he knows that the company in the room was not to be trusted, nor yet the government, for they have a set of men who they hire and fill their bellies that would hang him and anyone else if necessary. As the Spenceans discovered to their cost over the next few years, Robert was not wrong about that last part. Several of the spies who informed on Robert's tavern speeches noted that he'd started selling what they called seditious pamphlets at the end of each of the debates. The cheap political pamphlet, usually just a single sheet of paper printed on both sides, folded and cut to make either 8, 12 or 16 pages, was a long established as a cost-effective way to distribute radical ideas. This medium flourished in these hard post-war years. Now, Robert was at a disadvantage here. Even 3 years later, he had to acknowledge that, quote, it was true he could not write, but that he had caused his ideas to be committed to writing by another person. But the ideas were what mattered, and he did not let the small matter of illiteracy stop him from taking part in this crucial avenue of radical campaigning. He wanted to create a print venue where he could really focus on the political issues closest to his heart. Not only the plight of the working poor in Britain, but the overthrow of slavery in Jamaica, where his immediate family still toiled for their freedom. In 6 weekly instalments in the autumn and winter of 1817, he set about producing the most complete articulation of his anti-colonial, anti-slavery and insurrectionary political ideas of his whole career. They were among the most radical anti-slavery tracts published in English through the whole of the 19th century. For the title, Robert borrowed from one of his old mentor Spence's favourite passages from the Bible, Matthew 3:10. And now also the axe is laid unto the roots of the trees. Therefore every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. It was an appropriately incendiary image. The axe led to the root, or a fatal blow to the oppressors, being an address to the planters and Negroes of Jamaica, first appeared in late October or early November 1817. Now, on first glance, it's an utterly overwhelming document, comprised of editorials and correspondence from multiple authors, all writing in different styles, along with reprints of things like popular street ballads. As though deliberately to confuse a new reader, the first issue opened with a letter responding to a book review which had appeared weeks earlier in a completely different journal. This was followed by an address to the enslaved in Jamaica, asking them to resist peacefully. But that was then shortly followed by an article warning planters that the enslaved will, quote, slay man, woman, and child and not spare the virgin whose interest is connected with slavery. Another issue opened without preamble in the character of an enslaved mother speaking in thick Jamaican patois. This periodical fizzed with different voices, some rather experimentally positioned, and all competing for the reader's attention. Yet Robert had written almost all of the acts himself. Dialogue, debate, and multiple voices were profoundly important to the Spencean way of doing politics. Spence himself had published his most influential ideas in the form of a dialogue between different fictional characters, such as the strawman aristocrat who scoffed at an innocent mother for asserting the political rights of women and children in the rights of infants. This commitment to polyvocality was something Robert shared intuitively. In the first issue of another periodical he was involved in, he'd explicitly invited, quote, well-digested argument whether it comports exactly with the principles which may be the bias of the proprietors and conductors of this work, or in direct opposition. Robert was a debater more than a lecturer, and even as a writer, he thrived in an atmosphere of diverse perspectives. In the Acts, Wedderburn appealed to his working class readers in terms of their shared enemies. Recalling the experiences of housing precarity that had marred the early years of his marriage in his early years in England, he described landlords as little more than petty tyrants whose power was derived ultimately from theft. He said, the earth was given to the children of men, making no difference for their colour or character, just or unjust, and that any person calling a piece of land his own private property was a criminal. And though they may sell it or will it to their children, it is only transferring of that which was first obtained by force or fraud. This old truth, newly discovered, has completely terrified the landholders in England. I think it's interesting in particular that Robert Wedderburn is speaking from the perspective of somebody who had grown up in a British colony, and that idea that land ownership and ultimately derived from force or fraud would have resonated, I think, with lots of perhaps his non-white readers. But what made the Acts unique in this world of radical publishing was his explicit focus on colonial slavery's role in the system of extractive global capitalism, and the way that Robert positioned it as part of a wider conceptual dialogue between the enslaved in the Caribbean and the working classes in Britain. It was no less notable for the openly insurrectionary character of that dialogue. Robert had been deeply moved by the successful uprising of the enslaved in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in 1791, which had resulted in a protracted war between the black insurgents there and the colonizing states of France, Britain, and Spain, ultimately leading to the establishment of the Free Black Republic of Haiti in 1804. The supposedly unthinkable nature of the Haitian Revolution led to a collective sort of trauma among the Caribbean slaveholders and supporters of slavery in Britain, who frequently used the associated imagery of black on white violence to cow abolitionist efforts for much of this period. This is one of the reasons that British abolitionists had remained comparatively quiet on the question of general emancipation during these years. Indeed, even when the self-nominated official campaigning arm of the anti-slavery movement eventually did reform in 1823, after a couple of decades off, it took the name the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, partly to distance itself from any kind of revolutionary connotations. But because Robert had never been interested in being part of the official, that is white-led, anti-slavery movement, he had no qualms at all about celebrating insurrections and uprisings of the enslaved, or even explicitly encouraging further collective resistance. Indeed, when he was writing the Acts, an insurrection of the enslaved had taken place far more recently in the British colony of Barbados. Busser's rebellion, as it became known, had underscored the need for caution from the majority of the white anti-slavery thinkers in Britain, but Robert saw it more as a source of inspiration, something to be emulated. His most incendiary article in the Acts, addressed to planters of Jamaica, is justly the most famous passage in all of his writings. There really had been nothing like this published in English before. This is a short abstract, but I think it gives a flavour of the longer piece. It says, "Prepare for flight, ye planters, for the fate of San Domingo, awaits you. Get ready your bloodhounds, the allies which you employed against the Maroons. Recollect their fermentation will be universal. Their weapons are their billhooks. Their store of provision is everywhere in abundance. You know they can live upon sugar canes and a vast variety of herbs and fruits, yea, even on the buds of trees. You cannot cut off their supplies. They'll be victorious in their flight, slaying all before them. They want no turnpike roads. They will not stand to engage organised troops like the silly Irish rebels. Their method of fighting is to be found in the scriptures, which they are now learning to read. O ye planters, you know this has been done. The cause which produced former bloodshed still remains. Of necessity, similar effects must take place." Now, this passage anatomized the worst nightmares of the plantocracy, and it's come to define Robert's anti-slavery politics for many historians and literary scholars. Even today, he's routinely described as a firebrand, which was the term that the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, used to describe him in a letter to the future King George IV in 1819, a couple of years later. We think of him as somebody who was content to burn down the cane fields first and ask questions later, and there's certainly some merit to that description. Indeed, particularly during this period, he spoke and wrote like a man with little to lose, because he was, especially in the context of the febrile and oppressive political atmosphere of the Peterloo era. But this characterization can also obscure both the completeness of his Spencean vision for Jamaica and the hopeful utopian streak in his writings. Undoubtedly, his warnings of bloody retribution for slaveholders is gratifyingly full-throated, especially when read against the kind of mealy-mouthed equivocations of most of the white abolitionists of his generation. Nevertheless, he actually dedicated far more column inches in the Acts to outlining a better post-slavery world for Jamaica than he did imagining the violent demise of the plantocracy. Robert's plan for Jamaica was framed as advice to the soon-to-rebel enslaved. He provided a basic outline for a profoundly democratic and egalitarian regime of governance based on freedom of conscience, common land ownership, of course, universal suffrage, including for women, annual parliaments, universal educations, and publicly selected juries. For Robert, the first principle of fair government was the total abolition of social rank, which he saw as the ultimate foundation of all inequality, including enslavement. "My dear countrymen," he wrote, "it's necessary for you to know how you may govern yourselves without a king, without lords, dukes, earls, or the like. These are classes of distinction which tend only to afflict society." He warned the enslaved above all else to avoid the mistakes that allowed venality and corruption to creep into British system. There, Robert claimed, governors and landlords exercised arbitrary sway over truth and falsehood through the allocation of legitimacy to some claims and withholding legitimacy from others. Strikingly, Wedderburn saw women as essential allies. I'll come back to that. Saw women as important allies in the military defense of Jamaica from the encroachment of other slave-holding colonial powers. "Let every individual learn the art of war," he wrote, "yea, even the females, for they are capable of displaying courage too. You will have need of all your strength to defend yourself against those men who are now scheming in Europe against the blacks at San Domingo." Women were also identified as leaders in civil society in other key areas. For instance, they would be given the crucial task of educating children in revolutionary and anti-slavery principles, guiding them to attain the godlike strength of knowledge and independence. Older women were explicitly noted for their wisdom as being eligible to adjudicate on local disputes. He said, "Every dispute may be decided in your own villages by 12 men and 12 women. let them all be above 50. In a period marked for its paradoxes of limited and selective equality, perhaps the most radical aspect of Robert's 1817 plan was its faith in the judgment, wisdom, and strength of black women as key architects of a revolutionary republic. Now, in his late 50s, Robert felt he'd found his calling in life, to speak for the enslaved far more radically and directly than anyone else had ever dared before. The greatness of the work that I am to perform has influenced my mind with an enthusiasm I cannot support, he wrote. I must give vent. I have commenced my career. The press is my engine of destruction. He took it for granted that the system of slavery in the West Indies, just like the unrepresentative and corrupt parliament at home, could only be dismantled through destructive acts. Having honed his skills in the free and easies of Spencean politics, arguing with people at the pub, he brought his debating skills to bear in the form of print politics. Despite his own limited literacy, he saw that the press represented his best opportunity to enact political change that did not depend upon traditional, legitimate means. Do not petition, he advised the enslaved, for it is degrading to human nature to petition your oppressors. He was fairly explicit about the alternative means by which the new world order would need to be brought about. I come not to make peace. My fury shall be felt by princes bidding defiance to pride and prejudice. Truth is my arrow stained with African's blood, rendered poisonous by guilt. While they hold my innocent fellow as a slave, I will kindle wrath in their inmost souls. For Robert Wedderburn in 1817, just as for Frantz Fanon in 1961, violence was inevitable in the struggle against colonial oppression, but the press was the most important means to activate it. Now, Robert could not sustain the level of output and indeed creative inspiration required to keep this completely revolutionary political journal going for too long. The popular abolitionist movement was in the doldrums in these years, and perhaps his focus on Jamaica was felt to be a little too niche for many working readers in London, who would have preferred to focus more explicitly on their own problems. One Home Office spy reported that by the end of January 1818, Wedderburn is publishing a pamphlet called The Axe Laid to the Root, but it has not much sale. The Axe folded after its 6th issue, leaving its final sentence, perhaps appropriately, unfinished. Such was the lot of the ultra-radical journal. Not that this dampened Robert's optimism about politics. From the honour amongst thieves he had enjoyed with the Tailors' Union during the Army Contractors' Affair in 1813 to the fraternity he'd found in Spence's political circle, he saw what solidarity might one day be able to achieve. Robert could envisage a form of solidarity that not only spoke to how enslaved people and exploited free labourers were similarly oppressed, but how they might be able to share the same tools of resistance. The Axe was Robert's first substantive political foray, and it is rightly remembered for his extraordinary evocation of violent insurrection. But it also captured something of Robert's optimism about what the future might hold for the downtrodden and illegitimate. If not quite a manifesto, it nevertheless set a pattern for his rise to leadership in the political underground of early 19th century Britain. Now, within a couple of years, Wedderburn rose to become a leader in this working class rights movement. He took a lease on what was described as a ruinous hayloft in Soho at Hopkins Street near Golden Square. This is one of the few surviving handbills that he used to advertise the debates that he held at his chapel. And I think it's really telling of his capacity to blur the lines between the interests of a largely white British working class and the idea of insurrection of the enslaved, but also a sense of his kind of commitment to the idea of violent insurrection as well. So it's can it be murder to kill a tyrant? The following question will be debated. Has a slave an inherent right to slay his master who refuses him his liberty? The offspring of an African slave will open the question. The other thing I would point out about this handbill is the date of the debate that is being advertised, the 9th of August, 1819. That's a week before the massacre at St. Peter's Field, the Peterloo massacre, which is seen as the kind of high watermark of the British radical tradition of these years. So this is right at the kind of apex of the British working class reform movement pre-Chartism. And Robert Wedderburn is the man hosting the debates. Now, at the end of this debate, we learned from another Home Office spy that the whole assembly voted unanimously in favour of the slave to slay his master who refuses him his liberty. Maybe they were thinking mostly of their own situation in that, as slavery as a kind of metaphor for their lack of rights. But they also, the spy also reports Wedderburn sitting back, satisfied in his chair, and saying, "Well then, gentlemen, I can write back home and tell the slaves to murder their masters just as soon as they please." Which I guess kind of gives you a sense of the kind of subversive humour, gallows humour maybe, that Wedderburn enjoyed and brought to these discussions. He wouldn't be able to get away with this for very long. He was arrested and indeed convicted of seditious blasphemy early in 1820 and spent 2 years in Dorchester jail in Dorset, safely far away from London, where he could cause any more trouble. But nevertheless, he continued to write in support of both enslaved and exploited labourers for the rest of his life. And his significant and novel contribution to British social history is his capacity to understand their causes. This is intrinsically linked, that their enemies were essentially the same people, in some instances the same families, the same organisations. So I began today's talk by reflecting on May Day and its links to workers' rights movements. Of course, the phrase May Day, as we all know, is a homophone of one of our most famous French loanwords, Mayday. Me-a-day. Help me. Now, the local council and mayoral elections that took place across the country yesterday saw millions of predominantly working class people turn their backs on traditional parties to cast their votes for far-right candidates. Both Labour and the Tories have lost a significant number of council seats and a huge proportion of their vote share, with Labour losing one regional mayoralty to Reform UK, but hanging on to several others only by the very skin of its teeth. The rise of the far right across Europe and in the US has been framed by some as a backlash against the social and cultural progressivism of recent decades. Certainly it is a hallmark of right-wing populism to offer simple solutions to complex problems, often by scapegoating minoritized groups as dangerous outsiders. In its current iteration, British right-wing populism has consistently targeted immigrants and indeed refugees as the cause of working people's worries. Yet, and perhaps I'm being naive here, but I don't think that chauvinism alone can account for the appeal of populism, especially to the disaffected urban poor voters. Major structural inequalities in our society have only deepened, and young people's frustrations and sadness with the diminishing horizons of their opportunities is rapidly turning to anger or to nihilism. We have been here before. While some of the challenges faced by poor young people today are new, and perhaps yesterday's record high temperatures are a reminder of this, most of them are the same as those faced by Wedderburn's generation. Economic inequality, built on turbocharged global networks of capital and exploitation, is increasing. Traditional workers' rights are being eroded and protest rights prescribed. There's a widespread perception that traditional parties of government are, despite apparent oppositions, functionally the same. New technologies, perhaps not the spinning jennies of Wedderburn's day, but rather inscrutable artificial intelligence models, are rendering many jobs redundant, painting a rather bleak and uncertain picture of the future of labour. As we continue to count the votes cast yesterday, this is the live count, you can see what's happening. Perhaps it would be fair to describe this as a May Day election. Wedderburn's great contribution to the labour movement was his capacity to see the plight of the British poor and that of his own enslaved family in the West Indies as two aspects of the same system of global exploitation. The populists of his generation routinely described the condition of the English working classes as, quote, slavery, worse even than that of the Negroes in the West India colonies, encouraging their white audiences to look after their own and turn their backs on the abolitionist movement. Wedderburn, by contrast, recognised that international anti-racist worker solidarity, rather than any narrow-minded nativism, was the only way to promote the interests of workers around the world. As we turn to confront our own set of structural crises, our own group of grifters, chancers, con men and populists, perhaps we would do well to remember that lesson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for an extremely thought-provoking and, as you say, timely talk. I mean, do you think there are any, it's always dangerous to try and draw direct historical parallels, but why do you think it is that that sense of solidarity against exploitative capital appeared to have its moment in 1819, and now people don't seem to pin blame on capital, they seem to blame it on other outsiders?
Yes, I suppose the relative lack of access to a free press is one of the issues. I mean, Wedderburn was able to establish, he was penniless. I mean, his wife and daughters were listed in one census as paper flower sellers as their main occupation. But he was still able to access a form of press, some means of disseminating alternative ideas. It increasingly seems to be the case that the kind of social media giants are tending towards monopolizing political communication. I mean, obviously, traditional press still exists, but it's very difficult for any ideas that are outside of a relatively prescribed set of imaginable outcomes can kind of break through and to find a new readership. So I think part of the novelty of our situation is that we have these kind of algorithmically driven means of communication which tend towards courting outrage, and the simplest way to court outrage is to point to an outsider, to point to an immigrant, or to point to somebody who might look different, and saying, you know, they're trying to take what by rights should belong to you, and to frame it in nationalist terms. So the algorithm is the short answer, I think, in that it quite simply kind of drives overly simplistic explanations for intractably complex kind of global problems, and actively seeks to preclude kind of the type of solidarity that Wedderburn was interested in promoting.
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw it open and see what other people have to add to this. So I don't know if anyone has any questions or... yes, a hand at the back there. Yes, Sarah. Yes, sorry, I couldn't see you because of the light behind you.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you for the talk. But I joined a little late, so apologies if it was covered in the beginning of the presentation. But from the part I saw, so there was like, Wedderburn was never shied away from references to violence or appeals to violence in his communication. So in the current era, how would you sort of describe the role of force or the role of violence in just struggles or rebellions for just causes?
It's very difficult, isn't it, to speak about this in a way that's kind of responsible and but still gives kind of due weight to the intellectual processes behind work like Frantz Fanon's work, you know, about the essential place of violence in anti-colonial struggles, for instance. Yes, it is difficult. I think, in retrospect, if we look at that handbill that I showed towards the end of the programme, advertising that question for debate, does a slave have an inherent right to slay his master who refuses him his liberty? I don't know how that would go if we were to vote on that question right now. Maybe I should throw that back to the audience and say, raise your hand if you think an enslaved person has an inherent right to slay the person who refuses him his liberty. What I can say is that in the early 19th century, there were many popular accounts of white British people who'd been enslaved by Barbary pirates, claiming their own freedom from slavery by slaying the person who enslaved them. And that was an entirely uncontroversial, celebratory kind of narrative. And one of Robert Wedderburn's earliest pieces of political writing, he says, well, if you would celebrate a white person killing to gain his freedom, then what do you suggest I say to my mother, who is being held in bondage now? What do you suggest I say to my brother, who's still enslaved in Jamaica? And I think, the rhetorical question is that if violence is monopolized along kind of racial lines, and there can be no natural justice in a kind of moderate approach, and that colonial slavery consists entirely in monopoly on violence from one ethnic group or one racial group towards another, and therefore the only appropriate response to that is by an equal and opposite application of violence. So yes, without wishing to kind of endorse political violence, I think in some respects, Wedderburn's view of the world is internally logically consistent, and that his call for violence is, by its own logic, kind of justified in that particular historical context, I think.
Thank you.
Can you just wait for the microphone? Just everyone can hear you.
How did Ireland fit into his thinking? Because there seemed to be one reference which was almost used for comic effect, and fairly dismissively. And did his solidarities, were they capacious enough to include Ireland, or was that actually a complicating factor, whether on racialised or religious grounds or any other?
Yeah. So yes, that line that I include, the silly Irish rebels. He's actually very supportive towards Irish resistance to British colonial rule, and he sees. Well, there's some evidence in terms of the names of people that he interacts with during his time in London to suggest that he's familiar and has lots of Irish kind of people within his social circle, which would make sense because he seems relatively well informed about resistance in Ireland, elsewhere within his corpus. I think there's a body of scholarship which looks at structural resonances between the administration of colonial violence in Ireland and the administration of colonial violence in the Caribbean. And there's some kind of circumstantial evidence to suggest that Wedderburn was kind of aware of those resonances, and that he did indeed see Irish kind of anti-colonial resistance as part and parcel of a global, or at least Atlantic, model in which the interests of the wealthy were diametrically opposed to the interests of the poor or the dispossessed.
So it was the tactics, not the cause, you thought was silly.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. He thought that they would be better off waging a kind of guerrilla war, as the Maroons did in the West Indies. Yeah.
Just a hand here. Yes, can you just wait for the microphone, please? Thanks.
Do you see his ideas being picked up in the United States abolition movement at all?
It's difficult to know for sure. I know that stories about Robert Wedderburn were republished in New York newspapers by the 1820s. So there's some evidence to suggest that he's well, he's making the papers in America, so I suppose there's a route by which people could access those ideas. He often, I mean, he spends a lot of the acts related to the route talking about, or rather imagining a scenario where people in the West Indies are reading Spence's tracts, and that is one of the things that causes this kind of, catalyses like a popular uprising there. I suppose you can see kind of precedents of a kind of militant tradition within, or black radical tradition within like 19th century or antebellum kind of slave resistance in the US. But I haven't found the smoking gun where, you know, Frederick Douglass writes to somebody and says, I read that Robert Wedderburn, he has some good ideas, you know. I think it's safe to say we could read it as part of a kind of broader continuous tradition of enslaved resistance that centres organised, collective, and indeed violent uprisings.
So no reprints of his pamphlets or things like that?
Not that I'm aware of, not within the 19th century anyway. There's some reprints, I think, in the like 1970s and 1980s. So sort of towards the later part of the kind of Black Panther movement and stuff like that. But in terms of kind of enslaved people, I haven't found anything to suggest that so far. But you never know.
Oh, I've got Lindsay. Oh, Ros and then it might be easier with the mic to have Ros and then Lindsay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's a fantastic talk. He's such an interesting figure. I wanted to ask you something that might be a bit too obscure about Methodism. I went to a fantastic exhibition at the Fitzwilliam called Rise Up about black people in Britain. And I was surprised, though, I hadn't known this, and I should have done, that Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, who saw into print Phyllis Wheatley's wonderful poems in 1773, was herself a slaveholder.
Yes.
And that she inherited from George Whitefield, the Methodist preacher, the slaves from his Savannah, Georgia orphanage. Yeah. And I'm kind of intrigued. I don't know where Wedderburn sits in relationship to that double think, if you can call it that, a sort of Methodist activism, which sort of wanted to, as far as I can understand it, kind of corner the market in abolition for Methodism at the same time as it was using money from slaveholding to do that work. If I may have misunderstood it, so I wondered if you could clarify for me what's going on there, because I don't quite understand it, sort of taking money from slaveholding to support an orphanage for the children of black slaves and Indian natives in Savannah, Georgia, and also where Wedderburn might have sat in some of that.
Yeah. So So Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon, was the patron to Phyllis Wheatley, and to James Albert Euclosal Groniosaw was the first person, black person, to publish an autobiography in Britain, and Hastings, Selina Hastings, was a Calvinist Methodist, which is predestinarian sect. So there's God's chosen elite who are predestined to go to heaven, predestined for salvation, and there's not any necessity for personal agency in order to achieve salvation within Calvinist Methodism. John Wesley's Arminian Methodism, a bit later, comes along, and it's very important that you choose to embrace God, you choose to convert if you want to go to heaven. So they've got opposing positions on slavery because of their positions on the role of personal choice in terms of salvation. So Hastings and Whitefield might be considered kind of early proponents of like an ameliorationist or benevolist kind of slave ownership, where you're actually, in that model, you would actually be doing Africans a favour by enslaving them because it gives them an opportunity to learn about God and to be part of the kind of elect, spiritual elect. So that's one of the kind of denominational differences in terms of relationships to slavery between those two groups. Wedderburn himself talks about his struggle. So he's obviously got an extremely ambiguous or ambivalent relationship towards religion, towards Christianity. At one point, I mean, he's ultimately goes to jail for seditious blasphemy. by for a convoluted set of reasons, but he's also on being recorded by spies as saying that, oh, well, I think that all Methodist missionaries ought to be put to the fire because all they do is extort the poor enslaved Africans to give them their savings so that they can continue their missions. And also Methodist missionaries throughout most of the 18th century are not preaching resistance, certainly not. They're preaching a kind of quiet acceptance of the situation and the idea that, you know, you'll find your kind of heavenly reward for being meek like Jesus in the hereafter. I mean, another great quote from Wedderburn is about Methodist missionaries is, they ask us when we get a smack on one side of the face to turn round like that bloody spoonie Jesus Christ and offer the other cheek to be smacked or something like that. But he's like, I like jolly old Peter, give me a rusty sword. So he's talking about when St. Peter in the garden took up arms against the Roman soldiers sent to arrest Jesus. So that, if anything, kind of encapsulates his view of Christianity, is that he kind of likes the bits with swords, but perhaps doesn't feel that that turn the other cheek is an appropriate response to injustice.
Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I've got two questions, sorry. One's about your own practice as a historian, and I was struck by the way that you were calling Robert, and I wondered if that was part of your sort of rejection of his kind of the father and the slave-owning father. But my other question, I think you did such a beautiful job of connecting his significance to contemporary politics. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you assess his significance in context. Would you see him as a kind of a challenge to the way we think about the whiteness of radicalism, the whiteness of the working class? Or in Wedderburn, are we more seeing the exception that proves the rule? Like, are we seeing the outer limits of possibilities? Or should we be thinking about him as kind of representative of a more diverse tradition than we've maybe been used to thinking about?
Yeah, can I do those in reverse order? So the thing about his representativeness or his significance in context. Probably the most famous academic study, crossover, popular academic study of Robert Wedderburn is in Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh's book, The Many-Headed Hydra. And that's a fantastic book which looks at several instances of kind of transatlantic worker solidarity between enslaved people, anti-racist kind of movements led by working class people in Britain and so on. Now, there are several very compelling examples of that. I would suggest that they're not necessarily representative examples of the broader picture of British radicalism as a whole. Anybody who knows the history of kind of trade unionism or labour movements in Britain knows that there's a unfortunate but certainly very clear streak of nativism that runs through of kind of jobs for whites or rights for whites, within pretty much the whole history of the British labour movement. It's just an unpleasant reality, or for those of us on the left at least, it's an unpleasant reality of that history, and something that we really can't shy away from, and that we should actually, spend some time talking about. By the end of his life, or after he comes out of prison in 1822, Robert Wedderburn his fortunes within the British radical movement begin to decline as British radicals increasingly court a kind of establishment respectability that will enable them to start capturing seats in parliamentary elections, or to start pursuing a structural reform of the franchise and of the British Parliament. One of his closest allies is a guy called Richard Carlile, who increasingly, in his own radical work, begins to reproduce racist tropes and stereotypes about enslaved Africans, and to set apart the interests and the causes of abolition from domestic workers' rights explicitly. And by about 1831, it may be 1832, but by the early 1830s, Carlile, Wedderburn's staunchest ally, is publishing pro-slavery tracts by the West Indies interest, while Wedderburn is still publishing anti-slavery tracts. So by the time he dies, Robert Wedderburn is essentially alienated from the mainstream of the British working class radical movement. And in my view, it's not because he's changed, it's because the movement is cleaving towards more respectable ideas and trying to demonstrate that they can be in conversation with kind of cutting-edge scientific thought about human difference, which we would call racial science or racial pseudoscience today. So in some ways, yes, he's at the centre of the movement, but in other ways, the chronology changes things, and throughout the 1820s and 1830s, the pendulum swings back the other way, and he's falls, I think, afoul of the allure of this kind of nativist exclusionary thinking. The other thing, why do I call him Robert? It was initially just a practical thing in that I'm writing a biography. There are lots of people called Robert Wedderburn in his family, lots of people called James Wedderburn, and it was only sort of afterwards that I thought, well, this is actually quite a nice kind of way to foreclose the distance between like the reader and the historical subject. The name Wedderburn is really important in Scotland. It's one of the big kind of ancient houses, ancient clans of lowland Scots. Robert Wedderburn's uncle, so the family, the white side of his family are fully enmeshed in Atlantic Scottish plantocratic circles. His uncle, Sir John Wedderburn, was on the losing side of a case called Wedderburn v... oh, I've forgotten. Knight v. Wedderburn, thank you. Knight v. Wedderburn, which effectively led to the outlawing of slavery in Scotland in 1778. He's the same Wedderburn. There are several other kind of important kind of linkages to that family, which of course Robert himself didn't choose. And that name was in some ways kind of placed upon him as the result of sexual violence against his mother, who he identified more with. So yeah, I think in some ways it's kind of nice to call him Robert rather than Wedderburn, given that so many Wedderburns from this period are antithetical to what he represented.
I think I'd better let you stop and have a drink, but just before I do, can you say a little bit about your next work and what you're working on now? Because it is very interesting, and I think people might like to know.
Yes, so the project, one of the reasons that I'm here as a visiting fellow at Mansfield College this year is that I'm conducting new archival research into a global history of British anti-slavery since 1787. So just a short book then. It covers all parts of the globe and all aspects of British anti-slavery. The elevator pitch is that it's called Unfinished Business, an incomplete history of British anti-slavery, because of course the enslavement still exists within our world today. Abolitionists were never fully successful, but this book I think will offer a new view on the half measures, perverse compromises, and abject failures of British anti-slavery interventions around the world in that very long time frame, including some of their perhaps surprising links to the expansion of British colonialism in other parts of the world after the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
That's fantastic and fascinating piece of work, so I look forward to seeing that one too. Thank you very much for kicking off our series of public talks this term. Next Friday, we have Jemima Steinfeld, who's the Chief Executive of Index on Censorship, and she is talking about foreign threats or threats from overseas to the free speech of overseas students inside the United Kingdom, and well, people, not just students, but very often students. So do come along if you're interested in that. Look up the general series on the website. But I think apart from giving you a drink to say thank you, all that remains is to thank Ryan for a fantastic talk. So thank you all very much for coming.